All right, so the last section of Unit 7 is political parties, scandals, and civic engagement. Really, it's more about scandals. But I am going to kind of recap a little bit as far as the two major political parties. So in Unit 7, we've talked about how third parties and populist movements, whether they are populist movements from, say, the left, like Huey Long, or whether they're populist movements from the right, like Ross Perot, that regardless of what direction they come from, populist movements will influence these two major parties, right? We still have these two major parties. Remember, the Republicans came out because of the insanity that happens in the 1850s. Now, the Democratic Party that we're talking about does go back to Jefferson and Madison and Jackson. But again, if you talk about the political parties, particularly the Democrats, you've got the political party before the Civil War, and then what happens after is very different. And then I would argue what happens because of the Great Depression is another thing that's very different. And the Republican Party is born out of, the creation of the National Republicans and the Whigs and just the Free Soilers and the kind of this hodgepodge, and they become a party really born out of this question over Western expansion and slavery, right? So when you get to by the time you get to 1877, 1880, you're really talking about a new period when you're talking about these two major political parties. But they are the two that we have, and there are people that criticize the American system, the Electoral College, and but this is the system that we have, and it lends itself to two parties. Those two parties have to build coalitions. Populist movements have to get enough support, have to get enough momentum to propel change. You always have populist parties thinking they're going to be the Republicans, but that's probably not going to happen. We'd probably have to have a serious major crisis along the lines of slavery to get there. So again, these two major parties are really what we're talking about. Even though those other elements have kind of pushed some changes on them, they are the two that we have, and they have morphed and changed over time, and yet we can see some common through lines there. And then we'll talk about the political scandals and have just a brief conversation on the last part of it. So how have the parties changed over time? Well, some of this you should be able to think of yourself. You should be able to decide for yourself. We've looked at issues of identity, issues about the economy. We've looked at issues about foreign policy. You should have a sense for where these parties how they kind of ebbed and flowed over time. The one thing I would say about the Republican Party is that it has always been the party of business. Now, that business perspective at times looks at government as a good thing. Certainly, you look at building the Transcontinental Railroad or the Homestead Act. Those are major government interferences, right? But they are always in the service of big business, right? And so it their views about government interference kind of go back and forth depending on what's happening, who's in charge. Sometimes they're more comfortable with it than others. And then sometimes they're like, absolutely no government interference. But they always feel like business and economic interests are the dominant thing. That's what we've got to take care of, right? And think back to colonial history, right? The development of capitalism in the United States is one of those foundational elements. And so they are very much concerned with the economy, with how the government spends money, how the government brings in money, how is the government facilitating economic growth. This is one of the tensions that leads to the creation of the Republicans, is you have a lot of people saying slavery is retarding the American economic growth, and we've got to get rid of it. And so that whole debate, right, is part about facilitating economic growth and development. And so railroads and highways kind of fit into that. So you've got, it's going to depend. I mean, Gilded Age, Progressive period, post World War II, it's going to depend on what all's going on. You will see the Republican Party at different times has different attitudes about government, about the U.S. getting involved around the globe. So, for a long time, we didn't want to get involved unless it had to do with business and markets. And so that's how we get into imperialism. But then with World War I, we say, no, we don't want to be a part of the Treaty of Versailles. And so they reject that. 1920s, no, we don't want to be involved with the world at all. 1930s, we don't want to be involved with the world at all. And then you get to post-World War II, and suddenly we're protecting the world from communism all over the place, right? And so Ronald Reagan, your big kind of executive Republican, is the big anti-communist guy, right? So you have those kinds of, they kind of go back and forth. I would argue that, what we've seen with the Trump administration has been really a rejection of U.S. leadership, saying we should not have to be responsible for these things. And so this is a new transition, right? Going into, no, we don't want to be involved in global affairs. And so sometimes the Republicans aren't sure where they stand on that. It kind of depends. A lot of it had to do with communism. That was the big kind of motivating factor there. And that's going to have an economic component to it, right? Because communism is fundamentally an economic system, more so even than a political system. And so you can really kind of see how that's a big thing. The other part of it, too, is going to have to do with control of society. The Republican Party, even going back to the Gilded Age, tended to present itself as the party of morality, the party that discouraged people from drinking alcohol, that encouraged education, that encouraged, we want to make sure people are living a certain way. Right. So they've tended to do that, although sometimes they get uncomfortable with that when it causes them to have to spend more money. And so it kind of just goes back and forth. It's just really hard to decide. It depends, again, on what period you're talking about. But, if you're talking about McCarthyism, you're going to see them being kind of the party of, we're going to tell you what the moral way to be is. And so it's interesting that they have kind of this struggle with government control. But they are always the party about the economy. They're always the party about big business. Now, the Democrats on a different kind of level have kind of always been the party of liberty. Now, I use the term liberty kind of in a very extremely broad sense, okay? And I say that because, remember, these are the Democrats that tended, that liked slavery, liked Jim Crow. So obviously, when I talk about liberty for them, I'm not necessarily talking about everyone's liberty. I'm talking about the traditional kind of power structure systems liberty. But fundamentally, it's kind of comes down to this idea that tariffs were unfair, that they hurt the individual. Tariffs were an unfair protection for big business, right? And it was hurting the individual. That government shouldn't tell states how to run their communities. They shouldn't tell you how to run your schools. They shouldn't tell you how to do anything, right? They shouldn't tell you not to drink. They shouldn't try to control saloons, right? So very much the anti-temperance party. So they're the party of choice and liberty is kind of how they build themselves. And in doing so, they attract kind of an oddball mix, right? They attract immigrants and they attract workers because, we don't want these big bosses telling us what to do. We don't want government telling us we can't go get a drink. But then they also attract people, these kind of landowners in the South that want the tenant farmers and the sharecroppers, and they don't want the government interfering with that. And they want to teach what they want to teach in their schools. So we want to have, we don't want to teach evolution in our schools. We want people to be able to, think the way they want to. So when I say liberty, understand that that's a weighted term. Like, I'm not talking about liberty in kind of its raw, most idealistic form. I'm talking about the idea of people to be able to be as good or as whatever as they want to be, and the government's not going to get in their way. Now, that change is going to happen primarily with the New Deal, with the Great Depression, right? So many people get affected that people turn to the government and they say, wait a minute, okay, so we've let these, economic Republicans run things. And what they've done is they've created an economic system that limits our individual ability, right? So we think the government should come in and play a role in that, right? And so you definitely see in the New Deal, and this is different than progressive, right? Because remember, in the progressive period, Woodrow Wilson was the progressive that was more about kind of new freedom. The government's going to level the playing field and then let things go, right? Whereas Teddy Roosevelt was all about evaluating how much regulation, how much is too much, how much is not enough, right? And so the Democrats really, like, with the New Deal, they embrace this idea that the government can come in and level that playing field, that the government can come in and make sure that individuals have a fair shot, right? And so this idea of liberty begins to morph and change around the New Deal into something more about opportunity. And so so liberty is very much a weighted term, but you'll see it kind of transition into that. And again, it's not perfect because you still have Dixiecrats, right? You still have Jim Crow, you still have segregation, you still have the resistance to Brown v. Board. All of those things are taking place in the 50s and the 60s, Bull Connor, Orville Faubus, all that kind of stuff. So you've got those people, and they're going to affiliate themselves with the Democratic Party. But they aren't necessarily, again, this is about the liberty of them running their communities the way they want. And so what will happen is when George Wallace then becomes that segregation populism, that's law and order. Let's make society more orderly, right? That's the Republican Party is with Nixon's going to hook into that, and he's going to kind of bring those Democrats that have really since the New Deal started to help some African Americans, the executive order to pay people the same, Tuskegee Airmen, integration of the armed forces. They had started to feel like maybe their Democratic Party wasn't their party anymore, and so they kind of get pulled towards the Republicans a little bit. Now, again, that's not to suggest that the Republicans, absorb that kind of mentality of kind of, segregation, but it does mean that they absorb the mentality that local affairs should be governed locally, right? So the Republican Party really kind of absorbs that from that group of people. And that looks different ways depending on the circumstances, right? So it's kind of interesting, right? And you do have the Democrats as we go into the 60s, right? LBJ leads the fight against Vietnam. A lot of that has to do with this anxiety of kind of competing with the Republicans on who can be tougher on communism. So you start to see this change about what liberty is. And typically that really since the New Deal, we've seen that liberty has become about equality of opportunity. And this question that big business and excessive economic growth is, if the government doesn't step in, that it can hurt certain groups of people. And then, of course, big businesses would say, yes, but if the government steps in, that's going to inhibit business growth. And then if you inhibit business growth, it's even harder to help people, right? So you've got this kind of this circular argument that gets really difficult to solve. But that's kind of where the two parties are. Again, that's not an exhaustive list. I'm sure we could, if we wanted to dig deep into a particular element, you could find some other nuances to it. But that's kind of the big, broad picture about where the parties are. And the reality is, in many cases, that may be how we could broadly define the parties, but that's not how you broadly define the individuals in those parties. Individuals are just that, they're individuals, and they have a whole range of thoughts about different things. And so it's kind of more challenging to really hone into exactly what that means, right? But keep in mind, it's these populist groups that, whether it's William Jennings Bryan or H. Ross Perot or Bernie Sanders, that push these parties to change and or economic crisis, right? Panic of 1893 leads to progressive changes, right? With McKinley and then Teddy Roosevelt. The Great Depression leads to the New Deal. The 1970s stagflation leads to Reaganomics. The 2008 crisis leads to another populist wave, leads to the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. And in fact, when you look at the most recent economic contraction, right, because of the COVID virus, what has the government done? It's behaved in these ways that we saw in with the New Deal, that we saw with the 2008 crisis, where the idea is we got to put money in people's hands so they can spend it right now. But that is fraught with lots of questions and lots of critique, and it's not a perfect answer. And what do you do when a big business gets money and a small business doesn't? What do you do when somebody's refusing to go get a job because, well, I'm going to make more take taking unemployment than if I go work at a restaurant with 25% capacity. I don't have good answers for that. I don't know exactly how to resolve all of that. I'm just saying that this is part of what the tension is, right? And so you go from kind of this awareness of what these big, broad structural issues are. We do have some major political scandals. I threw in there Grant's whiskey ring because one of the things that you don't fully grasp about the weakening of the presidency going into the Gilded Age is that part of that's because Grant's administration, Ulysses S. Grant, who oversees much of Reconstruction, part of the rejection of Reconstruction is small part. I mean, a lot of it has to do with just being frustrated with Reconstruction. But part of it, too, is a sense of corruption within the Grant administration, and that corruption is tangled up with Reconstruction. And so Grant's whiskey ring is a pretty big scandal in the 1870s. You have the Teapot Dome, right? There's actually some minor scandals throughout the late 1800s. But remember, this is a period of big business. And so most people are just like, well, it's big business. What are you going to do, right? And so people don't really pay a whole lot of attention. Now, the muckrakers start to dig some of that stuff up, talking about political machines. So the outcome of the scandals from the Gilded Age are going to result in the progressive reforms that expand democracy. Now, what will happen in the 1920s is you have the Teapot Dome scandal. Remember, 1920s, small government. Nobody's really running the show. And so the Teapot Dome scandal is Albert Fall, the Secretary of the Interior, under Warren G. Harding. He basically takes a bribe to let an oil company drill in an area that is known for the oil reserves of the United States Navy. And so he's allowing that to happen, basically stealing oil from the U.S., and he's getting paid, and he's a shareholder and all this kind of stuff. And that comes out. They call it Teapot Dome because that's the location where they were drilling. And that comes out, and it's a huge scandal. He actually goes to jail for a little bit. And, it's because he accepted bribes. Several people in Harding's administration get in trouble. The head of the Department of the Veterans Affairs, he gets in trouble for taking medicine that was sent for the veterans of World War I and selling it on the market. Harding's administration was a hot mess. So Harding will die of a heart attack in 1923, and Calvin Coolidge takes over for him. And Coolidge will basically clean house. So part of the small government period of the 1920s is that Coolidge uses his executive office, and he gets rid of the corrupt people, keeps the people that he sees as good managers. So Hoover is a big one. Andrew Mellon, the Secretary of the Treasury. So he keeps the ones that are kind of the foundational elements of the 1920s kind of government and gets rid of the ones that were corrupted. So Teapot Dome, 1920s, Secretary of the Interior. Watergate, Nixon, right? Nixon, he gets impeached, or he doesn't get impeached. He resigns because he's about to get impeached. So that basically the House of Representatives goes to him and they say, yeah, we're going to vote for impeachment. And rather than go through that, he resigns. So he never actually gets to the impeachment phase, but it's very clear that there was some funny business going on. We don't know what he knew when, but we know at some point he knows about the break-in of the Democratic headquarters. He allows campaign funds to be used to pay bribes to keep people silent. There's a lot of kind of dirty tricks going on. Some of this, we blame Nixon for that. Some of that was just the way politics was done. I don't know that I would say it was all Nixon, but he definitely gets caught. And mostly because, as I pointed out with the Pentagon Papers, he uses a lot of energy trying to protect executive privilege, and it just doesn't work in the 70s. And so Watergate is kind of a major scandal of an abuse of executive power. Teapot Dome's corruption, Grant's whiskey rings corruption. Iran-Contra has to do with this question about the checks and balances. So Congress had passed in the wake of Watergate and Vietnam, right? Particularly in the wake of Vietnam, right? So there was a lot of concern after the Pentagon Papers came out that the government had invested all this money in Vietnam, and it kind of created this self-fulfilling prophecy, this what they call a sunk cost theory, that I've invested so much in this, I have to keep investing, right? And so the concern is that, so Congress passes a law, and I don't remember the name of it off the top of my head, that says basically that that they have to have congressional approval in order to, sell weapons to certain people, right? And so essentially what happens is the Iran-Contra scandal violates that, right? It's basically the executive office, right, the executive branch, doing a shell game, taking money from here and giving it to Israel, and Israel giving it to Iran, and then Iran giving it to Hezbollah, and Hezbollah giving it to Nicaragua, and to fight the Contras. And it's like all this movement of money, even when Congress had already said, no, we don't want you to fund the war against the Contras, right? We don't want you to do that. And so basically the Reagan administration goes ahead and does this, and they create this really complicated shell game of moving money and weapons around in order to aid this anti-communism effort. And the issue here is that it's a violation of Congress. It's a violation of Congress's power and oversight and ability to control war making. And so it is indeed a scandal. Now, like I said, Reagan gets out. It becomes clear, I think it's safe to say, that he didn't exactly know. It was kind of one of those things where he didn't know enough about the specifics, to really have been accused of knowing what was going on. But it was a lot of people under him in kind of lower levels that got a little power happy and thought, oh, yeah, of course the president's going to love this, right? And so this is kind of the nature of it. So a lot of investigations. Some people do go to jail. H.W. Bush does pardon several of them. So there's still some, occasionally you'll hear somebody reference the Iran-Contra and it being kind of controversial. But yeah, so that's kind of a scandal there. Again, that's an abuse about kind of the powers of Congress versus the powers of the executive branch to decide what to do with money and weapons and stuff. Clinton's impeachment, again, you have this strong kind of legislative branch. They don't like Clinton. They don't like his, and the funny thing is his agenda was very conservative, actually. But they don't like him. They don't like his popularity. And so they're investigating them. And the Clintons had done some things that didn't quite smell right. There's something fishy going on. And so they started investigating, and they were trying to find dirt. And in the process of doing that, they discover, Clinton had been accused of sexual harassment, right? And so he was dealing with not only investigations into his business dealings, but also an investigation into sexual harassment. And in the sexual harassment case, he's giving testimony before a grand jury, although it's over video. But and basically they ask him about Monica Lewinsky, because something had come out that maybe there was a question that how often did he have affairs at work, And so with Monica Lewinsky, he says, oh, I haven't had an affair with her. And then it comes out that there's all this evidence that he had an affair. And so basically he lied to a grand jury. He committed perjury. Now, there were people that defended him and said, oh, but that perjury, that's no big deal. But it is a big deal, right? Because you and I would get in trouble for perjury. So the president should get in trouble for perjury. And so they kind of accused him of that. And I think there's some abuse of office that he tried to hide some stuff and pressure some people into not testifying. So basically he goes to the House, he gets impeached, he goes to the Senate, the impeachment trial fails, right? So he gets through just like Andrew Johnson does. And so he's cleared. But it does really hurt his reputation. And part of what happens in 2000 is that, Al Gore doesn't want to campaign with him at all. And then I kind of threw in here Trump's impeachment. You have a different circumstance, kind of this idea of, kind of Michael Flynn. There's an act that goes back to the 1700s or to the, creation of the Constitution that has to do with that it has to do with the fact that you're not supposed to interfere with foreign policy, that Michael Flynn had interfered with kind of Obama's foreign policy agenda, and that all this effort had been done to protect Michael Flynn from prosecution, and that the Trump administration had then tried to silence it, tried to obstruct Congress, tried to prevent them from investigating. And, so he gets impeached in the House. House was controlled by Democrats, goes to the Senate, controlled by Republicans. And the Senate, of course, acquits him or clears him. And so you have a situation kind of like with Clinton. And so kind of an interesting, will Trump's impeachment be considered one of these scandals? It's certainly an impeachment, so it's a big deal. But is it going to be considered a scandal? I mean, only time will tell. It's too soon, and we don't know enough. Everything that we know is full of kind of partisan kind of opinions. And so it's hard to tease out what really just happened. And so, again, will it be listed on the scandals? I'm sure it'll be mentioned because it was an impeachment, but how we're going to interpret that, I don't know. I've certainly seen in my lifetime the interpretation of Clinton's impeachment change from, it's not really a big deal, to, yeah, it's kind of a big deal. It really is kind of scandalous. And so this is kind of one of the things that I think we're still coming to terms with. And so the last couple of points really are things for you to think about, like who are the prominent political leaders you would put on this list? Who are the ones you think should be on there? I keep saying Phyllis Schlafly should be on a list of prominent political leaders. If you're watching Mrs. America on Hulu, but even before Mrs. America came out, like she just really part of that conservative resurgence between Nixon and Reagan. Man, she's a huge driver in that. So you've got prominent political leaders, Teddy Roosevelt, of course, Franklin Roosevelt. Who would be the political leaders you would put on there? Who do you think made a difference in the way politics functioned, the way it worked, the way parties work together, the way the branches work together? The Supreme Court, the Warren Court, right? That declared Brown v. Board. So there's lots of ways you could identify prominent political leaders. So just kind of think in terms of that. And then lastly, one of the last kind of questions is, civic engagement. Why does it matter that we understand the branches of government, the checks and balances system? Why does it matter that we understand, political parties and the impact of third parties? Why does it matter that we talk about, the role of government in the economy or in regulation or, foreign policy and whether, why we go to war? And, it matters because we're the citizens. Remember that our preamble to the Constitution says we the people in order to form a more perfect union. Civic engagement is tied directly into our participation with that we the people. And it's not perfect. It's never going to be perfect. It's always going to be messy and sometimes it's going to be horribly dysfunctional. But that doesn't mean we just sit back and we take all the privileges of being American citizens, all the freedoms, all the, even in the midst of a coronavirus and the economic downturn, even in the midst of those things, think about the ways in which we still live better than people in Iran or people in China. And so it's not perfect, but we have privileges and rights, and there are responsibilities to that, to uphold those, to know the issues, at least some of the issues, know at least some of the candidates, begin to think about why it matters that the way our government functions, and are we happy with it or are we not? And to really think about why is it not functioning, or why is it functioning, or how should it function differently, or how should we change the priorities? So civic engagement matters. And I know that the Electoral College can make people sometimes feel like their vote doesn't count, but your vote does count locally, at the state level. And in really kind of a really broad way, it does count in the Electoral College. If you think about Florida in 2000, So, or the impact of third-party voters, right? So lots of ways to kind of think about politics in this period. So I hope this kind of helped give you a sense to kind of tie all these things together and kind of a relevant package. We're going into a presidential election year. So yeah, the conventions will be happening somehow this summer. So you've got that. And, you know, you'll have an election of a new president. I don't know how many of you will be 18. You'll have to be 18 by October, was it 3rd, I think. But if you are 18 by October 3rd, you can register to vote in the presidential election. And so you just want to be thinking in terms of how can you be civically engaged. Government controls, you know, funding for higher education, funding for public schools, funding, you know, how are student loans managed? You know, and they control those things. They control the taxes you pay and your parents pay. So you want to be engaged and involved in those things. So hopefully this was helpful. And anyways, thank you.